Welcome everybody to this podcast. Today I am with Guy Borgford, who, along with a variety of consulting positions with various organizations in the plant medicine space, Guy is also an artist and an avid student of consciousness. And today we are going to be discussing consciousness amongst other things. Guy also enjoys learning about our natural world. He runs a meditation retreat from his home in the North Cascade Mountains, right along a beautiful river, and counts the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, and working with the legendary and very beloved Dennis McKenna, brother of Terence McKenna, among his experiences. Guy, I just want to say welcome to you. I'm delighted to have you. And we're just going to free flow here. But tell me a little bit about what you are working on now, and also a little bit about maybe what we might want to focus on today, or what you hoped for us to focus on today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Jake. I appreciate it. Very, very grateful to be here with you today. So thanks again. I've been working with various forms of non-memory states of consciousness for a few years now. It's a pretty interesting story, but I started with meditation. And if you care to hear that little side story, it's pretty out there. Well, I'm just going to tell it, Jake. I'm just going to tell it. So
I think that's a great idea. And yes, I do want to hear very much about it.
Yeah, you bet. So I got a text message from my sister one day, and it was on the anniversary of our mother's birthday, who has been departed from this consensus reality for a number of years. And she was taken by a still unknown assailant and murdered in her home. So I was about 22 years old, I think, when that happened. And, so it'd been a number of decades that she had been gone. It was on her birthday, and my sister got a text message from someone, a friend of hers. And this text message was, "Hey, there's this breathwork class, and have you ever heard of it?" And my sister hadn't. And she said, "Do you want to come and attend with me?" And so my sister was feeling kind of down because it was the anniversary of our mom's birthday, and she was missing her and all that. And so she went to this breath class. And if you're familiar with holotropic breath work or transformational breath, there's a number of different breath patterns and things you can do to put yourself into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So she does this. She attends this breath class. She gets into the breath, and she enters this non-ordinary state where she was then kind of presented with this energy, this presence of this loving, very just filled the room with this loving presence. And she had this telepathic communication with this presence. And among the things this presence told her was, "Your brother needs to wake up." So she texts me this, and she texts me, "I want to tell you something. I know you're not going to believe it, blah, blah, blah." We get on the phone. She tells me all this. And I was like, wow, okay. When you get a message like that from some, entity from another realm that clearly has a higher state of consciousness than we do, it's probably a good idea to listen to that message. And so my intuition told me that I needed to start meditating. And I had toyed around with it in the past. I'd played around with meditation. I was always fairly mindful in my day-to-day, but meditation quickly caught on, and I just adopted it as a daily practice wholeheartedly. It became my favorite activity, really, my favorite pastime. And within about the span of about 3 months, I had this experience of kind of a major shift in awareness and consciousness, and almost like a breakdown of sorts, but not something that was in any way negative. It felt great, but it was also very discombobulating. Later on, a few months later, I learned this was a kind of a classic Kundalini awakening. I had checked all the boxes of, what most people experience when they go through that. And so shortly after that, that led me into plant medicine. And I started with some ayahuasca ceremonies, which led me into really exploring being of service through these non-ordinary states of consciousness and helping other people find their own path to their own understanding of consciousness and their own elevation of their own conscious awareness, which is a big reason why I'm the subject of what we're talking about today. So from there, I took this whole thing where I knew that I needed to commit to this work. The work I was doing was completely removed from this world of working with plant medicine and meditation and all the good tools that we can use in order to elevate our conscious awareness. And so I, mid 50s, decide to do this complete career change. And, in many ways, I would advise anybody against it, but I'd also say go for it and, follow your intuition and do what you need to do the work and do it daily. And so, I did that. And then I lost my job in consulting because I didn't really care about it anymore. It was something that just wasn't important to me. And then I made the very intentional shift to start working in this space. And I did that by volunteering. As you mentioned, I volunteered with Dennis McKenna and his 501c3, and did some other volunteer work in regenerative agriculture, regenerative systems design, which is a big passion point of mine. And then I started picking up a little bit of work here and there with different companies in the psychedelic space. And then through that as well, began to work my own practice, both for myself and my own personal healing, and my own personal expansion of conscious awareness. So not only through plant and fungi medicine, but meditation, mindfulness practice, nature immersion, which is a really amazing tool to dial things into the present moment. And I know you're a big fan of that, Jake. And, lots of other practices too. People can do breath work, as I'd mentioned earlier, which I experienced after my sister had her experience. And I've done it several times since, and it's incredibly powerful and healing. But also things like yoga and even things like gardening, for example, and learning to grow your own food. Anything that connects us to our natural world connects us to ourselves. And so, I've been working with people up here. I bring people up to my little cabin here in the mountains and work with them on their own path to healing and expansion of consciousness. And, I'm just very, very grateful and passionate about this whole space. It is absolutely amazing to be able to not only witness my own transformation, but then to be able to help people find their own path and assume their own sovereignty over their own wellness and their own consciousness is really just incredibly gratifying. And so that's kind of my story to this date where we are here. And I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much for that. You brought up so many things. If you saw me looking down, I was taking notes. I'm interested in the breathwork piece because that personally works for me, and how I personally view it through my more or less biomedical lens is 10th cranial nerve, vagus nerve therapies, if folks want to Google that. You also mentioned non-ordinary states of consciousness. All features of consciousness are fascinating for me. Plant medicine, of course, being of service and connection. I think those are huge. And for me, for example, the endocannabinoid system is all about connections, but we're here to talk about what you're doing. So does anything about either the breath work or the non-ordinary states of consciousness, and you mentioned helping others. So I think that I get the sense that a lot of folks are feeling the need to wake up. And the way I think about that personally through the lens of inhabiting a nervous system is enhancing my awareness. So I think we're all on a lot of the same pages as far as that goes. Does any of that resonate with you, or would you like me to kind of take the next step and go a little further?
Oh, it all resonates with me, quite honestly. So, you mentioned the vagus nerve, and and that is obviously part of this. I would say the hardware of our energetic being, and that's something that is now being talked about a lot more. That mind, body, spirit connection. And I think that even Western medicine is really opening up to this, because there's too much evidence surfacing that supports this theory, as a lot of people call it. I, for one, am 100% believer in this. We are energetic beings experiencing ourselves, i.e., the universe, in human form. I absolutely love that definition of the human experience. And it is, I think once you kind of go down that road and you start approaching your own being holistically like that, and taking into consideration the energetic or the consciousness aspect, some people call it a spiritual component, however you want to refer to it or relate to it, but that taking a very conscious and regular and daily practice that supports that, and giving yourself time in order to nurture that is absolutely critical to our overall well-being. I've met people who are insane athletes who are so incredibly fit and just these human machines in terms of endurance and strength, and their energetic being is a mess because they never give themselves time to really go within. And many of them will argue, well, my running is my meditation. And of course you can achieve flow states through all these different activities, which I know that you and I have spoken about in the past. However, quieting the mind and getting into that space where there is no thinking about the next mile or the next step or cramps or pains or whatever, and just being able just to be quiet and to be in a state of peace, that's where the real magic happens in terms of our energetic being and being able to be grounded, being able to be present, and to be able to pull that then into our everyday lives. That's where the real magic happens. And what I've kind of leaning into is my own definition of what conscious awareness is, which is, it is that little magical present moment between stimulus and response. It's that split second between when you get some kind of input and then how do you respond to it? And that can be an interaction with another human being. It can also be just the reaction to what's going on in nature, for example. And
That's,
to be able to,
yeah.
yeah.
So let me riff on that a bit, and then
Sure.
we'll bounce it back to you, because you used the key buzzword that I heard was that split second.
Right.
And so I want to tie this a little into hardware in terms of neurologic features. And my meditation background comes from Zen. I lived in Nagoya, Japan for 5 years as a young man in my early 20s, studied martial arts, studied shiatsu, which is 5-element meridian therapy. For years and years I did these, and also was very much interested. I had a true taste of Zen there, not in myself, but in some of these folks that I associated with. And there was an old Zen monk, if anyone wants to Google, by the name of Takuan Soho. Soho, first, that's the family name, Takuan. And he wrote a series of articles or a series of letters to sword masters, and sword masters would come to speak with him and study with him. The greatest swordsman of all time, Miyamoto Musashi, who was involved in over 60 death duels with the sword. So you thought MMA was a serious sport with Khabib Nurmagomedov being undefeated at, I think, 38-0. Musashi was undefeated in death matches at 60-0, and he eventually became a very spiritual person, and he actually gave up his sword because he realized he could not lose. And the very act of carrying this sword meant people were going to challenge them and he would have to strike them down. So Takuan Soho discusses this Japanese concept of mushin, M-U-S-H-I-N, if anyone wants to do a little research on that, where he talks about if when you are staring down your opponent who has their swords drawn, if there is even a hair's breadth, he didn't use a split second, he used the word hair's breadth, of a gap in your thought processes, then you will be struck down. And there's a wonderful autobiography, or rather a biography of Miyamoto Musashi, not the Book of Five Rings, which is used for a lot of business applications, but this is written by a gentleman by the name of Eiji Yoshikawa, who, it's a great book. It's kind of a boy's coming of age book, but anyone who's interested in flow states or martial arts, I highly recommend it. It's a big tome of a book. And Musashi went through developmental processes from the age of a cocky teenager at the Battle of Sekigahara, which was a big Civil War battle, all the way through his development, his spiritual evolution, working with Takuan Soho. And so there's a lot of history that ties directly into not only performance, which is the secondary aspect of this, but also the amounts of awareness. To tie this into meditation and psychedelic states and the hardware of our neurology, there is something that and Guy, I want to hear your talk, but let me riff on this a little bit longer. There's something neurologically speaking called the default mode network. It's our typical default mode that we're in, where we think of ourselves as these separate, isolated individuals. And part of what psychedelics are doing, we know from research ongoing and still in its infancy, and also part of what meditation are doing, are that they are working on the identical neurologic and biochemical processes and the neurology from slightly different approaches. And what happens when we enter a flow state is the default mode network kind of gets downregulated, and something that I don't like the term is called the task mode network. I think that that's a misnomer. I would prefer that it was called the skill mode network. When we do things that we're really skilled at, many of us have this, even if it's just knitting or playing music or football, soccer. I'm thinking of this from a guy's perspective. So things that I have done neurologically, that I have a lot of experience in, my nervous system has developed skill to. There's a sense of comfort and pleasure when we do skillful acts, things that we are particularly good at. And the default mode network is associated with this really limited definition of self, of who I am. But when we get into a flow state, laughter is a flow state, singing in the car is a flow state, singing in the shower is a flow state, dancing can be a flow state. When we enter these flow states, we get this decrease of the sense of ourselves as an individual. It just disappears. Surfing for me is the high art of that. Not that I practice the high art, but that I really personally get into those states for seconds at a time. And I'm not a good surfer, but the real artists will talk about that, especially getting tube riding or getting barreled as they speak, where you're actually in the tube of the wave and time and space kind of slow down. There's all these neurologic reasons for this. And the technologies for accessing these states are very old. When combined with some of the neurologic features that we're now understanding, it kind of can enhance these old technologies, in my opinion. And I think that's a part of what you are doing. So long rant. I think I just wanted to get that all out there. Talk to me about what resonates with that for you, please, Guy.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jake. That wasn't a rant. I hope I never have to come up against you in a game of Jeopardy, because I think you would kill it. You would
It's
squash it.
Jeopardy is about memory, and my memory is,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, it's actually pretty good, but this is about something that is
yeah. I
different.
could
Anyway,
just see you with like, $40,000 and I've got like negative $11,000. I don't want to ever go there. But no, for sure. So, default mode network, of course, there's a lot of talk with that in the psychedelic space because of these medicines' ability to quiet that place, just like meditation does. Like you said, they've done studies, they've done brain scans of both psychedelics and meditation. Those brain scans look pretty damn close.
same
And
pathways.
yeah, exactly. And to your point about flow states, which I really love too, because flow states are states of being present. They are states of being in the present moment. Again, that's where the magic happens. And that magic can take the form of, surfing the most, flawlessly on a beautiful wave that comes in. It can be art where you're just flowing with art, or it could be writing, painting, whatever your medium is. And that flow where there's no self-critic, you're just letting it all go. The same can be said, like one thing I do, because I live up here in the mountains, is just taking a daily walk in nature and to be able to tune in to the sounds. Like right now is the best time of the year because all the birds are back. And so you go out there and you just tune in. And like I've got a highway across the river here, and you can hear traffic on the highway and stuff. But the ability to just have that as background noise and tune in your awareness to the sounds of nature and the birds, so incredibly powerful. And when I do it, I get the same energetic flow of prana that I do when I'm in deep meditation, but my eyes are open and I'm walking around. And it's those kinds of practices, in our everyday, like what are the things that you like to do in your life, and how can you dial in your conscious awareness into those practices to really be present, really be aware. And that's where the gifts start kind of emerging. And you're not thinking about solving problems or anything, you're just being present, you're just with the birds, the sounds of the birds, that's it. And it is, it's a very powerful therapy.
I
Yeah.
love that, and I need more of that in my life. Living in the city where I'm particularly sensitive to noises, and it's assaulting to my nervous system, and I have to be and I walk every day, get my 10,000 steps in.
Oh,
I'd much rather do that in a nature space, but it let's tie this a little bit into some of the neurology and soundscape, bird sounds. And we have become a very visually oriented culture. Throughout much of our history of humanity, including pre-Homo sapiens, but for sure Homo sapiens, which is, 120,000 years ago, civilization is less than 1/10 of our biologic makeup. And before we were artists, well, I can't say that because there were artists back then, but before we were consultants and doctors and accountants, we were hunter-gatherers. And when we would be in a forest scape, we weren't there's the saying in whatever movie that was, there's always a bigger fish. We were not the biggest or the strongest features of the majority of the time that our neurology had developed. And so our soundscape was critically important to our awareness, especially as we were moving through the culture. And our visual medium, although very useful, we also had to listen. And so the concept of the world as being out ahead of us, uh, with a visual orientation versus all around us with an auditory is something that fascinates me as a visual artist and a painter. I think you can relate to this. And I think that and Dennis McKenna talks a little bit about this because he had a stuttering problem lifelong that was cured by a high dose psilocybin journey. And part of the problem with the stutter is there's this feedback that goes a wire between the pronunciation and the hearing of our own voice. That was cured in one time of a lifelong stuttering problem.
That was
And
Paul Stamets.
Paul Stamets, correct. I stand very corrected.
Yeah.
Thank you. I stand corrected. You are okay. Yep. And so I think that also when we do a psilocybin experience, the set and the setting are very important. And there are all kinds of studies on how music can actually be therapeutically enhancing to the psychedelic experience. Meditative practices can help it become more deeply ingrained. And I think of this idea of me personally accessing a more primitive, holistic time of, and I know that's kind of very Rousseauian if you want to put it in philosopher terms, but not the ideal of being in the forest, but the ideal of being connected with nature and how it's very much a soundscape. And the birds, for me, I hear the sirens and I hear the garbage trucks backing up and I hear the lawnmowers and the weed whackers in the city. But whenever the birds sing, it is a note to myself to tune in, to relax, to be here. And I miss the access to nature that I don't have here while in the city. So any thoughts on that, Guy?
Well, I mean, every day I wake up and I express gratitude for being up here in the mountains because I lived in the city for 40 years. And this journey of better understanding myself, both egoic self and my higher self, through this work led me out to nature where it was just this incredible draw. Like I needed to leave the city. And I didn't know why, but there was a case where I was following my higher self. I was tuning in daily through various practices to better dial into that state of conscious awareness and following my intuition in what I needed to do. Of course, it all worked out, but I had never lived in the country before. I grew up in a small town in Canada and then moved to city when I was 18 and lived in cities my whole life. And so I was like, what am I doing out here? And I remember after I first moved and the cabin was a mess, it needed all kinds of, renovations and stuff. And I'm up here by myself. And I remember doing a mushroom journey and asking the mushrooms, like, why am I here? Like, what am I doing up here? And of course, intentions are a very important part of this work, even through meditation. But more importantly, I think, is through plant medicine work is really having a strong intention. And so I was like, my intention was, what am I doing up here? And the mushrooms just told me healing. That's it. Like it was my own healing, healing of my family unit, healing of the community up here and the people who are up here. Healing of the land. This land is, on the river, clearly stolen from indigenous people and indigenous families, and all the trauma around the land and the families that were taken from it. Healing of the people who come up here and convene with the mushroom, and I hold space for them, and getting them on that path. And it was, you sometimes when you follow your higher self, your egoic self will jump in and go like, what are you doing? Like, you got bills to pay, you got a mortgage, you got a car payment, like, what are you doing? And it is always a lesson in trust, and trust, some call it faith, but it is trust in that higher self and trust in that connecting to that collective consciousness, connecting to our higher self, and really listening to that voice, and not only listening to it, but following through on it, and then also acting upon it. And that's where that kind of conscious awareness, that split second, comes in, when, especially when you're talking about engaging with other human beings who can sometimes be on a different journey, can be having a bad day, they can be acting out with anger, fear, what have you. You know, it is that's part of our practice, is to, how do we respond to that? Always, how do we take that split second to choose love over fear? Completely changes the whole dynamic of all the energy in whatever that interaction is.
Great. And that instantaneous choice, which is really, if you talk with criminals, or really hardcore criminals, murderers who have killed people, they will tell you that there was that second of choice where they did not. And how many times in my own life, first of all, when our nervous system is traumatized, when we have excess stress or anxiety, our circuitry is clogged up and we are not making the best decisions. So, but nonetheless, there is always that moment of, and this is where the meditative state can be very good training, because we are, if we can observe what we're thinking, we are not our thoughts. And you only have to move back behind that just an inch or so to be able to see that there's a gap there. And I just to look at my notes. So trauma, I want to talk about asking the mushrooms, and I have some thoughts that I had written down ahead of time. I might read from my iPad here. And also for me personally, you mentioned this concept of being unwillingly called. I wonder, why the heck do I talk about these things that we're talking about right here? And I am not a I am not, this is not something that I have been charging at, but this is more something that I think of it as being a calling. So let me bring this back into my background of Zen, and if I can find it here. Well, I just want to, because it's a quote from a Zen master, and
what, you don't have them all memorized, Jake?
well, and you know, the way that they're translated, it comes out so just much more poetic than I could possibly ever do it, but I could certainly, oh, here we go. This is, if we want to speak, and I'll try and look at the camera while I'm looking at my iPad here. If we want to speak accurately about the nature of consciousness, we should remain silent. Mm-hmm. As the Zen master once said, if I speak, I tell a lie. But if I remain silent, I am a coward. Why would one be a coward if one remains silent? Because I would suggest that some of the most profound problems that humanity faces are those of separation and isolation. And we are living in an age of despair that is fueled largely by disconnection. And I think that was the beginning of what we were really talking about. So
100%.
I just bring that up. And I think also I've got a little over 2 years in the hospice space, working with folks with all types of horrible prognoses and less than 6 months prognosis to live. And at the end of life, for many in our culture, not for all, because there are some people who die well, just as there are some people who live well. What I have seen, and in participating in team meetings with the physicians, the nurses, the caregivers, the volunteers, everybody talking about these cases, is the sheer high degree of angst and terror that some of us will be facing as we move towards what is, let's face it, it's inevitable. So and I also pulled a bunch of studies, but it just doesn't feel right talking about those right now. But just be assured that there are studies for that. And it ties into something that if you Google, it will come up. It's called the fifth wave of public health, where really these concepts of separation and isolation and the loneliness of COVID, or the loneliness of growing old and your friends have passed, and you had 8 best friends growing up and 7 of them are gone, and your kids are all of this. Google fifth wave of public health. And so I definitely get the sense, for me personally, this was one of I usually don't feel nervous about a podcast because I'm usually talking a lot about botanicals, and it's my wheelhouse. So I have a skill there. But the psychedelic space, even though cannabis is technically a psychedelic, the psychedelic space is where I have some experience, but I'm also very much a dilettante. And so I'm not wanting to overrepresent what I know, but just the sense of a calling. And again, depending on how you gauge religiosity, I'm fundamentally an agnostic. However, I also was raised in the church, and it reminds me of Christ. I'm not sure if it was before his trial in the wilderness, but I think it was before his crucifixion, where he climbed the Mount of Olives, and 3 times he said, hey, do I really need to go through all of this? Because it's not going to be comfortable, to say the least. So talk to me, and you're someone who's taught me a lot about this space already, and we can talk about the neurology, et cetera, but talk to me about that human component of somebody who's a seeker, who's maybe looking for a breakthrough, who is looking for a psychedelic experience and wanting to go through that. And talk to me a little bit about your experiences with that, what you think is important, and how that all can work.
Yeah, sure, Jake. Well, I mean, obviously everybody's a snowflake. I don't mean that in the derogatory sense. I mean that in the philosophical sense, that we are all completely unique divine manifestations of energy in human form. And so everybody's journey, everybody's path, everybody's approach is all going to be unique and different. And that's the same to be said for psychedelics and psychedelic experiences. No two are the same. You can take the same medicine, like, for example, ayahuasca, where you don't build up a tolerance. You could drink ayahuasca 7 days in a row and have 7 completely different experiences. It's like a different medicine.
That is a very great point, and I think one of the fundamental weaknesses of Western medical culture is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding by PhD, MD level folks that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for psychedelic and psilocybin therapy. For various reasons, including a complete lack of external validity for these studies, is a very unique approach. And the buzzword for what is coming up with all of this big data is real world evidence. And what you're talking about is an N of 1 phenomenon and a very personalized experience, which is what really is required for a lot of plant medicine, which I can speak to. On the psychedelic side, that's not something that I would care to speak to, but please riff on that a little more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid point. I don't think that Western medical or research models really fit psychedelic and plant medicine frameworks at all, because at the end of the day, other than set and setting and having a strong intention and approaching the medicines in a respectful and thoughtful and intentional way, there's no framework. I mean, that's the whole idea. Like, Western medicine is trying to control things. They're trying to put things into boxes, and they want to try and have predictable outcomes, predictable experiences. There's companies that are trying to strip the whole mystical psychedelic experience from the medicines and just deal with the indication, i.e., take this pill, you're going to not be depressed anymore. That's not how they work. And, for us to try and put them in a box and control them is the antithesis of what the medicines are about. The medicines are about surrender, and it's surrendering your egoic self, surrendering to that higher energy, that higher self, the collective consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And so, a lot of these institutions and companies that are following these Western medical models, I think a lot of them are really exercises in futility, because
or limitations of the capacity. And just for me to be clear, I'm talking about randomized controlled trials, but I absolutely agree. And I think it's a cultural feature and a cultural blind spot that we have this need for predictability for something that is really hard to predict. But what we do, and some of the science has shown us, because not all science are RCTs, is that the intensity of the psychedelic experience, it has a therapeutic element to it, and also the degree of discomfort that people have. Oh, I don't want to have an uncomfortable experience. Dennis McKenna's brother, Terrence, said, from the shamanistic perspective, you want to do this in large. I'm not going to say the doses, because that we don't want to give people the wrong idea. But in silent darkness where no one can hear you scream, and I'm not advocating that, but the discomfort and the letting go are essential features, and we see this across so many things, this idea of letting go. And flow states can only be accessed by a letting go, just like going to sleep is a letting go. At a certain point, we are awake. At a certain point, we're asleep. And also the model on how it works with disease. And there's a lot of studies on psychedelics and depression, which show very promising, PTSD, which can be promising. But what about people who are healthy or are just in a tough place in their life, like a midlife crisis? That's something that I don't see a whole lot of emphasis on. And also it's something that I don't see a whole lot of emphasis on talking about connection are studies of this happening in groups, especially with trained facilitators, how the group dynamic can be important, and how the circle up, not during the time when everybody is journeying, but the next day, to kind of everybody shares with their experience, and you can say, oh, I relate to that. These are things that we have a blindness to in our culture, and sadly, that's another one of the things that I feel I have been called to talk about, because it's very uncomfortable. It makes people feel uncomfortable, makes me feel uncomfortable, making people feel uncomfortable. But these methods with complex botanicals, because of the lack of statistical, we want to use the methods that have the best statistical validity. And an RCT is not it, because of the lack of, as I said, external validity. It's not the best tool. You can know that something's not snake oil from an RCT, but you can also spend millions and millions of dollars to just learn a little tiny bit about something that most of us can see with our own eyes. Anyway, that's another what I would call a rant, Guy, but please share with me. And also, I had a note here about the group setting. Talk about.
If I can speak to that, and I want to speak just to your notion of discomfort. I want to be clear that, discomfort is something that can happen and often happens, but it's definitely not necessary. And it's not necessary to have discomfort to have a very meaningful, productive, and even mystical experience. Those can all be achieved without any discomfort. And that's part of the adequate preparation process. And really really being mindful and intentional going into the experience. And then it also helps having someone experienced to help you do that, and to also sit with you during the psychedelic experience, and then assist you with integration afterwards. And by no means, and I do all that, and by no means am I pumping my own shtick, because I really don't have a lot of time for individual practice work. However, I think it's really important that anybody who is considering plant medicine do so in a very intentional way, and that they also adopt, in advance of that plant medicine experience, a daily practice of spiritual connection, whatever you want to call it, connecting with consciousness. And I love meditation. Of course, I'm a big proponent. I always tell people, oh, you need to meditate, practice meditation. I always say no judgment, just go, it's a practice. Like, you just practice, everything's a practice. However, some people go, well, I just can't meditate, I can't do it. So I'm like, well, how about this? You wake up in the morning, and before you reach for your stupid phone, i.e. get it away from your bed, if at all possible, just lay there and just think about what you're grateful for in your life. Like, it could be the fact you're breathing. I mean, that in itself is a miracle. You start getting into your knowledge around the systems and what it takes for us to be able to breathe. I mean, it's fascinating and amazing, and it's awe when you think about it.
And breath is a connection between the outside and the inside, is also involved with this 10th cranial nerve that we discussed
Correct.
very briefly.
Correct.
And also, I'm very happy that you said that about the discomfort piece, because and there's that brings up two thoughts for me. One, we talked about, and if anyone wants to email me, there's a great study on music and its ability to assist through the process, but also probiotics. And I did prep a little on this because the probiotics are the friendly bacteria in our gut. And those friendly bacteria, the good ones, make serotonin. And serotonin, and we know that and that's a neurotransmitter that helps calm things down. And the bad ones will create irritating chemicals to our nervous system. And there's a very interesting dynamic that goes on between the friendly and the unfriendly bacteria. But psilocybin is a tryptamine, and serotonin and melatonin, which affect our mood and sleep, and the bugs make these, they're also tryptamines. And so pre-experience, taking a week or two and adding probiotics to the diet, adding yogurt or fermented foods to the diet. I'm not a huge fan of probiotic supplements, because you never know if you're getting a living pill that you're taking or not, or those bugs in there alive or not. But in the yogurt that you are, in the kefir that you are, in certain fermented products like miso that you are. Kombucha, the booch, yes, another fungus friend of ours. And
that gut brain axis is a very real thing. And there's a lot of actually discourse in the psychedelic space around that, and that probiotics are just one tool that we can use to balance that out prior to any kind of ceremony. A dieta, as they call it in the ayahuasca culture, is cleaning out the system from all the crap that we have in our food supply, and having a very strict diet leading into ayahuasca is paramount to the medicine even working at all, let alone having a good positive experience where you're not throwing up all night. And I actually recommend a dieta for prior to psilocybin experiences as well. I usually try and advocate for 2 weeks. If you can go vegan, great. Cutting out all red meat, cutting out highly processed food, sugars, salts, cutting out media diet. And that's another really important thing that affects our overall wellness, is social media, news media, video games. All these things are very fear-based. They incite in us this kind of fight or flight reaction and all the endorphin and other hormones that course through our body and are released in unnatural states through that. We could go on a whole other podcast about, things like cortisol and, and all those other things that are, necessary for our survival. But when they're in a constant state of flow in our bodies, are highly damaging, right? So, preparation, that's part of that kind of, I always say your journey begins with plant medicine weeks before. When you set the intention, I'm going to do this, that's when it starts. That's when you've got to start that reprogramming leading into the medicine. And then after the ceremony, the integration work is taking all that neuroplasticity, all those new neural pathways, and reprogramming your brain to think in new ways. I always say it's the hardware upgrades, the medicine, the software upgrade is the integration.
Say that one more time.
I always say the medicine is the hardware upgrade. The integration is the software upgrade. So
I love it. I love it.
When you take the medicine, there's all these studies out now that it actually creates neurogenesis, new neural pathways,
dendritic spines. So what is happening, we know this from studies, is that one of the ways that we can't really create a whole lot of new brain cells. When I was going through school, you used to never be able to do that. We now know that that's not necessarily the case, but where enhanced skill or intelligence comes from is more interconnections between the different neurons. And we know from studies that that is part of what's happening with psilocybin therapy. So it's actually enhancing the connectivity, again, this key word, of our nervous system. And when I look at screens, I've taken a diet away from a lot of social media. I have moved my iPad and my phone away from they're not even in the bedroom. People are like, oh, well, what if there's an intruder? I have other solutions for that. However, but I don't even want them in, and there is a almost an urge waking up. Where's my phone? I have installed red lights so that if I have an idea at night, I can get up. I used to get up and do it on my iPad, and that assault happens. So I have red lights, and then I have reading material in there that if I get up, because I'm frequently up, just always have been with my sleep cycle around 2 or 3 a.m. till about 4 or 5 or 6, and then I'll take a little nap for a half hour or an hour before I get up and go. But that my bedroom is a sacred space, and for the integration of my awareness, it's almost like when I'm looking for my phone, I'm looking for a distraction back to this sense of discomfort from this discomfort and take me away from this discomfort and scroll through the news feed and, oh, how are the banks doing today and all this other stuff. That is one of the best things I have done for my personal and emotional health. And I would encourage anyone to do that. And I think also a retreat scenario where instead of just doing a weekend, Saturday, Sunday journey space, taking a week ahead of time or more if you can afford it or have the inclination, and going through an intentional process with diet, with probiotics, with music therapy, with journaling, I think can be, and then also at the tail end, having an integration. I think those are very important. And I would also say for your intention, think of it like you are an attorney. Be very specific exactly about what you are asking about and how, because I find that just from personal experience, it is almost like you're dealing with an attorney, and it is almost many times a literal interpretation of. And so if you don't think about it, for example, this isn't a psychedelic story, but I was exhausted after medical school. I had just finished my boards. I remember on my third day of boards, which was on my third day of boards, I was so tired, and I think I had just had like 20 tests in a row, and I'm sitting there for one of my last few tests, and I was so tired. I couldn't remember my social security number. And I was like, oh no, I'm in big trouble here. And I just kept saying to myself, putting it out to the universe, I just need to sleep for 3 months. I just need to sleep for 3 months. I just need to sleep for 3 months. Shortly after, I got myself into a pretty bad accident. It's called a Lisfranc injury, if you're an orthopedist or anyone who understands. I was off weight-bearing activity for 4 months, and it took me another year after that to learn to walk without a limp. So I got my wish. I got my wish, and I slept for 4 months straight. In many ways, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. But in terms of stating your intention to the universe, think of it like you're an attorney. Anyway, that's my
No,
2 cents on that.
that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, for intentions and for manifestation about specifics. The universe will deliver those manifestations as she will. It's usually nothing like you had, put up on your mood board or whatever the hell you use to frame that, but it's usually better. As long as you are doing the work and yeah, it's always better. But be careful what you wish for is another good one. And I think the third thing is regarding psychedelics and intentions. I agree. Specificity, it's easy for me to say, is I think really good for people who are fairly new to the medicines. I've done quite a bit of work with it, and I have had some of my best breakthroughs where I put it out to the mushroom. I just go, what's next? That's my intention. What's next? Like,
I have to ask you about that. Okay. I believe it's Terrence.
Well, I mean, first of all, it's complete surrender, right? You're like, I don't know what I need. You tell me. Like, you're just like, what's next? Okay, go ahead.
Terrence McKenna, Dennis's brother, talks about these entities that occur that are in a DMT journey that are so outside the realm of something I could have imagined in my own brain, and that he called them self-replicating machine elves.
Yeah.
And other folks will talk about asking the mushroom a question, and that can be during the journey space. Do you get the sense that you are encountering a separate entity? If so, why? Or do you think that that could be something that is just of the makeup of what's going on within our own skull cap here? Talk to me about asking the entity a question, and does it necessarily need to be thought of ahead of time?
Well, I think first of all, like, working with these medicines, the more you do it, the more you develop a relationship with that consciousness. So, to coin them as entities, I think is kind of relegating them to our materialist perspective.
Brilliant.
And I think of them as different kind of parts of consciousness and different levels of consciousness. In experiences, I definitely have conversations, and I'm not saying I'm like talking to the mushroom, hey mushroom, what's up? But there is a telepathic conversation, especially in terms of ayahuasca. Like Mother Ayahuasca, you can ask her anything. You will have a conversation with this higher form of consciousness. And for me, it's the same with the mushroom. You mentioned DMT, so I've used DMT a number of times. I use it as part of my consciousness practice, very sparingly, but invariably for me, I've never encountered machine elves, so to speak. I've never encountered entities that are where I have like a visual manifestation of what they are, outside of once, which was my first big breakthrough with DMT. And the entity I encountered was what my consciousness picked up as the mother creator. And it was from that point on where I was like, okay, I believe in God. And since then, I've had experiences like one where when I lived in Seattle, I had done some DMT on a beautiful summer morning in my backyard. And as I was stumbling back into my house after the peak had subsided, the light's coming in through the trees, and I kind of look up, and this kind of voice goes, you know, you can call me God, right? Like this. So because I always refer to the universe or consciousness, and sometimes I use the word God. I mean, it's like, it's a lot of people have an aversion to that because of religious trauma. So I use it very sparingly. But I think they're all interchangeable. And,
Very
this approach, this kind of grander metaphysical, almost a quantum physics type approach to consciousness is something that I personally adhere to, which is that it's kind of panpsychism, which basically everything is consciousness. Some things are sentient and they have that extra level of awareness, but I mean, everything is, when you think about it, like I go walking down the river and I look at all the rocks, and each rock is completely different, completely like just been around for like some of the millions of years sitting there, right? Like, I mean, it's mind blowing. I mean, a rock can be pretty mind blowing when you think of it from the perspective of consciousness and conscious awareness. So I can get real deep and like spacey and philosophical on the subject. So maybe I should just dial it back in.
okay. So let me just be quiet here for a minute, because that brought up a lot of things, and I don't like to have dead space, but I think I just need a minute so let's just have a little quietness here for just a few seconds. Well, I don't want to have too much dead space, but one thing that I think of is that I feel, and I don't mean this as a disparagement to folks who are religious, but I feel that the term and the word God is almost a polluted word. And what do I mean by that? I have a very deep, profound religious background. I read the entire New Testament from cover to cover as a second grader, the New English version. My mom tells a story of when I was 3 years old. I went on a little trip. Instead of talking about dinosaurs or Spider-Man, it was what happens if we go to sleep and we don't wake up, as a 3-year-old. The Old Testament tells us that, and again, I don't, depending on how you phrase it, I'm an agnostic or a psychedelic Christian, or however you want to. I'll be happy to talk about that, but I don't think most folks want to hear. But the Bible talks about how if we see the face of God, we cannot live, and so that there is some type of a barrier between this waking consciousness and the total awareness of where all that is, so that if that were truly revealed to this little 3-pound neural net between my headphones, it would be akin to a disillusionment of those processes. So I think that the word sadly, because there's been so many wars fought over religious ideas, not only between Christians and Muslims and Jews, but also between Catholics and Protestants, and also between Lutherans and Presbyterians. And we get so attached to these ideas. So I think that is an important piece. But again, for me, it takes me to what are features that enhance my awareness. And maybe that's a good time for me to hand this off back to you, Guy.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And I appreciate that reference to the G word. I couldn't agree more. I am not a religious person at all, yet my consciousness practice is the most important thing in my life. And I can say that for me, consciousness has an important in my life equal only to my children. And they're grown children, but they're still my responsibility to keep them safe, right? So there's that. The thing about all of this, and when you talk about religion and you talk about how most of the horrors of humanity have been over religious ideology, and therein lies another paradox to be revealed. And I think that consciousness is learning the awareness of the paradox and being aware of it, and not only accepting it, but then also acting into it. So I always go back to the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. I think it's the most emblematic kind of icon of consciousness, in that at the end of the day, everything rolls into everything else. And when religions try and profess that they are the path to God, there's the big old red flag right there. If it's some shaman who says, "Oh, I am the path to your healing," that's a red flag. It is anytime anybody kind of raises the specter of duality, to me, that's a red flag. It is about, and I believe work with psychedelics, it is about they're just tools. They're tools for the individual to experience their own path to conscious awareness. That's it. And yes, they are energies. Yes, they are consciousness. Yes, they are spirits. They're all of that. And yes, they are tools, just like meditation is a tool, just like going out in nature and just sitting with nature and getting your hands in the dirt and and marveling at the wonder in everything is a tool. I'm learning how to grow food up here, right? And learning about regenerative agriculture and all that thing, and rewilding and native species and all that. And one of the things that I have found so amazing is learning about soil and the complexity of soil. It's like a trillion organisms in a teaspoon of soil, or something, like something ridiculous, some ridiculous number in a teaspoon of healthy soil. And to me, that is like, whoa, like awe, like awe.
It blows me away when I see so many correlations between soil information transfer in the endocannabinoid system of the body. And again, here we are, it is back to connection. And
Yes.
you mentioned the shaman who says, maybe dogmatically, this is the only way you can heal. Or the religion that says this is the only way to God. And the need of letting go as a feature of certain aspects of healing. And I would just posit as a question, is our need for in Western medicine as a dogmatic institution? And it's just a question, but I am starting to see it, and I've lived in other cultures, and I've learned another language than my mother tongue. And I see that there were other ways to see the world that are very valid through the lens. And I traveled extensively for years throughout Asia as a young man. Every culture has certain strengths that it cannot see, and every culture has certain weaknesses that it cannot see. And I think that what psychedelics are pointing to is a type of a blindness. I mean, even neurologically, we all have a blind spot where that optic nerve exits. There, you can't see anything there. But yet our entire consciousness, we're not aware of it. Robert M. Persig in the book, which I don't recommend because it's a little dated, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, talks about the blindnesses in cultures, and he calls them the ghosts. And so the ghost of predictability that we see as something that could possibly be real, but another culture might look at that and laugh. It's ridiculous that you're trying to have a predictive element. That, and I'm not saying we shouldn't look, but it's just something that has been coming to me lately that I feel necessary to talk about. And again, it makes me uncomfortable because I know there's always pushback, but I just am an imperfect vehicle to be saying these things. So have you worked much with end-of-life care? I think it's really and as I mentioned before, I've worked, I've done 2 years of hospice work as a volunteer. What I love about the hospice work is that using a very small amount of my time and energy, I can make an enormous impact in somebody's life. I love that about the end of life space. And how I did it was before medical school, was I was a massage therapist. And so I would do foot massages or hand massages or even whole body massages, depending on the scenario. Um, and I see, and there's a study, and use of classic hallucinogen psilocybin for the treatment of existential angst due to cancer. An amazing tool to just get at a perfect tipping point that can make a profound difference in someone's life. And I know at the end of life, there are things that people, whatever it comes next, if anything at all, that there are things that folks want to or maybe should be saying to their kids or to their families or to their loved ones, that there's some hesitation, whether it's an apology for something I did, or whether it's something that I've never told you that I just really want to tell you about. This opportunity for healing and this wildly separated world that we're going through, it just strikes me as a beautiful fit and a beautiful tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am a big fan of using these medicines, both for individuals going through end of life experiences, but also for their families. And I know there are some that are practicing group ceremonies for the person who is transitioning with their families, which I can imagine are just incredibly powerful.
Another group setting, Guy.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And there's a lot of work, a lot of exploration done in this space. Have you seen the interview between Roland Griffiths and Sarah Brack?
Well, I don't pride myself in doing my homework, Guy,
Okay.
because nobody does their homework all the time. But you sent that to me, and I believe
Oh,
it
I
was an
did.
hour and a half or a 2 hour video. I watched the whole thing because I like to do my homework.
It's so
I can't
good.
always do it. I would recommend that. I'll put a link to that in the description comment as well.
So good.
He
It's
was
so good.
and he's a pure scientist who did clinical trials at Hopkins.
Uh-huh.
And part of what his legacy is he's created an endowment that is going to hire, Hopkins is going to be able to hire somebody whose salary is paid for and is completely immune to the money, which I find is horrifically polluting to the medical science, and have somebody just to be able to publish in perpetuity on psychedelics through that wonderful and highly prestigious institution at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
Anyway, talk to me more about this video. Why did you send it to me?
So the reason I sent it to you was, Roland Griffiths is, for anyone who doesn't know, as Jake mentioned, he's a long-term, scientist and researcher into psychedelics, but he's also a long-term and very advanced meditator. So not only has he been meditating for, I think, 20, 30 years, he started kind of later on in life, similar to what I did. But he's also experienced non-ordinary states of consciousness through psychedelics, but then done a ton of research on it as well. But what got me, and I hope I don't start crying because I cry real easy, but what got me is the point. So Dr. Griffiths got diagnosed with terminal cancer. He has apparently 6 months to live. And him and Sarah are long-term friends. And so this interview is very intimate. And when he starts talking about his terminal prognosis, his eyes light up. Like he just gets, like, you could see the excitement on his face. And he starts talking about how he went through 2 days of grief with his partner of just like, holy shit, I'm going to die. to this, all of a sudden, this, oh man, I'm going to finally find out what this is like. Like it is for me. I mean, I so related to that because through psychedelics, I believe I've experienced in many ways what death is like. And if you look at the history of psychedelics, for example, back in ancient Greece, they had the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Which was arguably and almost uh, absolutely without a doubt a psychedelic sacrament where ancient Greeks would make this pilgrimage for like 2 days, no food, no water, apparently. Like there was just like this like austere pilgrimage. They would partake in this sacrament, and the term they used was "you die before you die," and it is that going into that state of awareness where you understand that this is just a tiny slice of what consciousness is, and a tiny slice of our experience, and that that's our job, is to remember that. And that's all of our jobs. Everyone goes, what's my purpose in life? Your purpose is to remember who you are. Your purpose is to remember that you are a divine manifestation in human form, and you need to act like it. So stop being pissy in traffic, start having some compassion and love and empathy for your fellow human beings. Stop dumping poison on the soil to kill things you don't like. All these kinds of things. Like just, spread your awareness to the world around you. And so that's my rant, Jake. That's my rant for the day.
Love it. Love it. Oh, wow. Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Well, for anybody interested in psychedelics and exploring this particular path, whether you have an indication like a mental health challenge, or you feel you've got some trauma that you're certain you need to address, do so thoughtfully and intentionally, and I would say cautiously. And there's nothing to be afraid of at the end of the day. But I can tell you just a quick anecdote is that I just got off a call. One of my new roles is a guest success lead for Behold Retreats, which is an international retreat organization. They run retreats in Portugal and the Netherlands, Costa Rica, Mexico. And the conversation was with a peer of mine there who had a 5-MeO DMT experience a year ago. And she said she's still integrating it. She goes, it was terrifying. And so this is someone who had tons of experience with medicines. And, for whatever reason, she went into this experience, maybe not prepared. I don't know. Who knows? But she's very conscious of it. She's very much working on it. But it's just kind of a word of caution. Like psychedelics are very powerful medicines. We are very complex, layered beasts at the end of the day. I always use the metaphor, we're like one of those elastic band balls that are all tangled up. And our stuff, our stuff that's troubling us in our lives, or our search for purpose, or whatever life stage we're at, it's all tangled up, and psychedelics help us untangle that. But we need to do so thoughtfully and intentionally, and with other daily practices. And I know you're the cannabis doctor, and I can tell you that.
I think of myself as a natural medicine doc who also majored. I have, let's just say I've got well over 10,000 hours in, not only on the study of the plant, but in the therapeutic uses, et cetera, et cetera.
Got it. Okay, I won't call you that.
I
won't call
think
you
of
that
myself
ever again.
as an old school naturopath. That's how I think of myself,
Okay.
of the kind that are largely extinct from this planet. But I have a classical training in conventional pharmacology,
Yeah,
physiology, etc. But
yeah,
I'm deeply in tune with the nature and the use of plant medicines. I'm in tune with this aspect of end-of-life care. And I am somewhat unwilling and imperfect messenger for a lot of these ideas. So I'm grateful to be here. Also, where my real passion lies is how these aspects integrate into flow state experiences, and downregulation of fear-based neurology.
yep, absolutely.
The flow state is really where my passion is, and I consider myself an apprentice. Um,
Same, same.
Guy,
And yeah, and flow state is synonymous with conscious awareness. They're
and
the
neurologically the opposite of trauma and fear.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Love is the opposite of fear.
Amen.
Absolutely,
Amen.
absolutely, 100%.
Guy, how can people find you? How can they get a hold of you?
Well, I would say the best thing is to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my most active channel. Guy Borgford. Borgford is an Icelandic last name, just so you know. It means bump on a log. It doesn't.
Oh, very.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It mean Borg is a island, and Ford was fjord, so an inlet.
Oh,
Island is an inlet.
the
Yeah,
beautiful picturesque island in on those crystal clear deep waters.
that's right. That's right. That's me.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
me.
Very good. Very good. Well,
Yeah, so LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn. Thank you so much, Jake.
thank you so much, Guy. I'll look forward to connecting with you with LinkedIn. I've been enjoying your posts, everybody. I'll put a link also to Guy's LinkedIn connection down below. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. We should maybe think about doing this again sometime soon. And Guy, I'll look forward to talking with you offline anytime later in the day today or tomorrow or whenever works for you. Keep up your good work. And thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. Guy Borgford, much appreciated.
Namaste, Jake.
Namaste.
Thank you.